Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video podcast from the International Institute for the Studies of Security Verona. My name is André Carvalho. I'm from the Military Strategy and Intelligence team. And today with me, we have Dr. Sandro Teixeira. Dr. Sandro Teixeira is a professor at the Meira Mattos Institute at the Army Command and General Staff College, an academic institution from the Brazilian Army. And Dr. Sandro Teixeira is also a PhD in military science. It's nice to have you with us today, Dr. Sandro.
Thank you for the kind invitation. I'm very proud to receive it, and I hope that we have here a great time with these questions and discussing about technology, war, and things about the contemporary war.
Thank you very much. We will sure have an amazing debate today. And the focus of our interview today is on the endless debate of the obsolescence of heavy weaponry, especially field artillery and main battle tanks. Well, infantry win firefights, tanks win battles, and artillery win wars. Is with this amazing statement from the old Imperial Guard that we start our discussion today. Because during the last decades, land operations have been characterized through the deployment of light and highly mobile forces, especially with limited objectives in the theater of operations, in rapid maneuvers of penetration or flanking in punctual zones, and not in broad fronts of battles. These considerations ended up casting doubt on the suitability of large units of tanks and heavy artillery in contemporary theaters of land warfare, especially due to the difficulties of dislocating them to operational areas with the compatible speed with that of the evolution of the land force. Moreover, the advances in precision striking, loitering munitions, and loss and unmanned vehicles seem to render heavy weaponry on the background of the contemporary battlefield. These developments led some military analysts to say that heavy weaponry is obsolete either for the lack of strategic mobility or for the mere vulnerability of the aforementioned systems. However, well, in recent events such as the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War in 2020, and most recently during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we can see the counterparts relying heavily on field artillery and large units of tanks. So, Dr. Sandro Teixeira, to begin our debate today, uh, what do you think are the reasons behind this endless debate on the obsolescence of heavy weaponry?
I think that kind of debate is a never-ending debate who feeds itself in the military and postmodernism that we live, in which technology have a great role in, and technology could are a way to avoid attrition, to avoid friction, to avoid several problems that happens since you begin a military operation. So when we talk about a possible obsolescence of heavy weapons, of artillery, like in the American and NATO intervention in Afghanistan, you have some voices saying, let's end artillery. Artillery will be subordinated to infantry and cavalry or armored units, and will be break as an armed force inside an army. That debate had ended with Nagorno-Karabakh, with the Syrian civil war, and if are not dead, that debate are killed now by the effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We are seeing great quantities of ammunition being depleted, being used by the Russians and by the Ukrainians, and a debate that had died with the Cold War coming back to life. That is the debate of industrial warfare. So to understand that thing, to understand how this idea of the obsolescence, the possible obsolescence of heavy weaponry continue to grow, continue to keep rolling, despite the facts saying the contrary, despite the facts saying in the battlefield saying otherwise. This kind of debate continues living in a fiction in which we could have a great new technology in the battlefield that could be a game changer. This is not true. This is not true because there is not a technology that could transform completely the face of war. This is to reduce every aspect to war to a technological debate that will won't serve the purpose of war and won't serve the technological debate itself, the need for innovation itself. That kind of point of view will not help to understand the dynamics of war, the dynamics of the use of military force in the contemporary world. So when we have such kind of debate, we have a thing that is a great exercise of this military fetishism. And the worst kind of thing that happened since the end of the Cold War, it's that kind of fetishism began to be nurtured not only by military officers, but by civilian authorities in defense roles itself. One great example of this is the reforms made by Donald Rumsfeld in the United States defense apparatus in 2001, 2012, 2002, 2003, in which he prescribed a large army. He decided to not to have more a great great military, great effective, great numbers in the military, and decide to change that for technology. For a moment and for a quick intervention, this model, this so-called Rumsfeld doctrine could work, but the fact that he'd been tested in two of the largest American wars in time, Iraq War 2003-2011, and Afghanistan War 2001-2021, shows that that kind of intervention relying small effectives, small numbers of military men, small numbers of boots on the ground, and application of high technology shows us that that debate wasn't effective. Another example that we could see from military history is the Second Lebanon War. The Israelis believe in some concepts and about the use of high technology, high precision guided munitions against Hezbollah, and didn't work. Hezbollah could manage to ambush and to block several of the Israeli divisions in close to the Litani River, which for the Israeli military planners, an impossible thing to happen, and that happened. And the Israeli forces, especially the armored forces, beginning to get bogged down and beginning to be ambushed by Hezbollah commandos with anti-tank weapons. So that kind of anti-tank ambushes that we had seen in Ukraine are commonplace since the early 2000s, since the even in Iraq, American forces, coalition forces had been ambushed several times. British forces had been ambushed in Basra, and the need to provide active protection systems for armored units, armored and tanks, main battle tanks, beginning in that moment, we need to develop countermeasures to hold against these. So that kind of debate is a debate that it's, despite the facts on the ground, continue to roll. It's like a dead zombie. I don't know how to define, but it's a kind of zombie that, for most, the facts try to bury them he continued to get outside his tomb and continue to live. I don't know. It's a night of the living concept. I don't know. It's a terrible thing, but need keep going and have a great powerful appeal, especially with politicians, because you you see many politicians, especially within the Ukrainian war, many Western politicians. That kind of weapon will be a game changer for Ukraine. And we see the Russians conquering more and more territory. Where is the game changer thing? Since early April, we keep hearing the same discourse. That kind of weapon will be a game changer. The weapons are delivered for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians use it against the Russians, and the thing don't work as the prophets of that kind of discourse had promised. So that's a more one evidence to show that that idea of the obsolescence of heavy weapons are not real and are not founded in a serious military debate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sandro. Outstanding response because, well, it always makes us think that, for example, during the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, when we saw Azerbaijan hitting lots of Armenian tanks with loitering munitions and attacking using, well, large fleets of drones, people started again this debate saying that, okay, this is the end of large MBTs units. This is the end of field artillery as we ever seen them. And then right after this moment, we saw also a large deployment of field artillery, both from the side of Azerbaijan and from the side of Armenia, even in saturation operations, or even just to, well, to try to collapse the will of the enemy. So it seems that it's a never-ending debate of technology versus everything else. And people sometimes seems to believe that technology itself will revolutionize everything, although it's important to remember that technology applied outside the scope of doctrine, strategy, and etc. is not very useful. So thank you very much for your response. And building on that, uh, would you say that it is important for modern militaries to maintain these units of heavy weaponry? And if it is, why it is so important for modern armies to maintain large units of heavy artillery such as howitzers and large units of armored vehicles such as main battle tanks?
Well, for modern military, and we are talking here especially about the Western model military, which are important. Even I'm not especially Western man, but Brazilian, who are deeply inspired by Western roles, and the Brazilian army are deeply inspired by Western roles and models, especially the United States Army. We have to keep in mind why we need uh, great quantities of men and material in face of in like artillery or a great armored fleet, a great armored force, because armies need to be ready to face every challenge in this enormous phenomena called war. And war could come in could manifest in several ways. In the face of a irregular war against a group, against a non-state actor who can have only light infantry forces like Taliban, like the Afghanistan's Taliban, or like a terrorist group who doesn't have more than technicals, more than Toyotas with 50 cal machine guns in their as their weapon. You need to have an army prepared to deal with that kind of threat, but you need to have an army prepared to deal with another army. And even that we face uh, a irregular enemy, tanks have a hole in that. You could see by the large deployment of the Israeli forces, armored forces in the operations, especially in the Gaza Strip since 2008, in the operations that the Israeli forces had entering Gaza, they didn't enter without tanks. They always entered using tanks. In many ways, tanks are the tip of the spear, the first line of contact with the enemy, the vanguard of Israeli forces in Gaza. Tanks are important because they have a lot of holes and they provide as much needed support to infantry, especially in an urban role, especially in urban fights. So we are going to the we are going through the 21st century, and probably the 21st century will be the century of wars in cities. I'm not saying that we don't have wars in rural areas, in non-habitated areas, but we will have many fights in towns, many fights in cities. Urban warfare will be one of the most visible until now, and looks like a tendency from the century. Uh, Urban warfare will be a tendency of war in the 21st century. We are seeing that we had seen that in Iraq. We had Afghanistan was an exception. Nagorno-Karabakh was half an exception because most of the Azerbaijani advances were not in habitated areas, are mostly in flat areas that they could manage to quickly conquer from Armenia using armored forces and lots of artillery. But Syria had shown urban warfare, the Russian-Ukrainian war, mainly urban warfare. In the Donbass, many of the fights are in towns and cities of the Donbass, not in many fields, because in the open fields, the Russians had an advantage in tanks and artillery, and they are using that advantage that they have to press on Ukrainian forces. So urban warfare will have a role in that, and tanks had a role in that. When we can study several battles, and two great battles of the 21st century are the Battle of Mosul by Iraqi forces against the ISIS, and the Battle of Maravi, that was a Philippine force, Philippine army with Philippine Marines fighting against ISIS in Maravi, are one of the biggest battles of the 21st century. We have battles in the battle for Kiev and in late February and early March was a big battle and an urban battle. The Russians trying to conquer the suburbs of Kiev and managed to get forces in several suburbs of Kiev, and they pulled out after political negotiations, and because the the loss of unity of effort, the incapacity to sustain the effort, the military effort on north of Kiev. So we have tank has a role in modern warfare. Also with artillery, we are seeing that, and even with irregular forces, we could take something that will be for many people not considered as a conflict, but we could get an example: the United Nations mission in Congo. They built a forward intervention brigade with artillery, with tanks to fight several groups that are in northeastern Congo and southeastern Congo. And in the battle for Goma, which is a large town close to the Ugandan frontier, to the Congo-Uganda frontier, and the region of Great Lakes for several frontiers there. The battle for this city has been taken by the movement. If I'm not wrong, the movement is called M23, that they decided to fight the United Nations peacekeepers. So they need a heavy weapons brigade to fight them, because the until there the light profile role provided by UN peacekeepers with bulletproof vest, helmet, and assault rifle are not enough to fight the guys of the M23. So they need artillery, and they have needed tanks, and they need to use large quantities of ammunition. So this was an effect, and I'm not talking about war. I'm talking about just something that many scholars could say was a leak, a low intensity conflict. And you have a hole for tanks, and you have a hole for artillery. So in modern warfare, and with the coming back of what we call industrial warfare, we will have a hole for tanks, and we have a hole for artillery indeed, and several improvements in that condition, because many of the tanks that we have now actually filled in the battlefields or preparing to go to the battlefields are projects, and some of them that recalls to the Cold War. So you have several attempts from the defense industry to develop a new kind of tank. We can say some examples. The tank that Rheinmetall had presented 1 or 2 weeks ago at an European defense show, the Armata tank family that the Russians are developing, the Chinese attempt to develop a new main battle tank, the Turks that are developing indigenous main battle tank, also the Pakistanis and the Indians who are developing, trying to develop main battle tanks. So this shows that kind of thing, and even the Americans who are providing upgrades to the Abrams family, these things shows to us that tanks are not forgotten, but they are they are a component of the military technology debate, and with the ground application of force. So when we talk about tanks and we talk about artillery, we must understand that tanks and artillery will have a role, and especially at the Pacific, when we have a Chinese growing and growing and growing each day with military capability and with military capacity, we need to understand that artillery will have a great role in the Pacific if war happens. And maybe even if war doesn't happen, because they could serve as a piece of a complex deterrence system of China or of the United States and his allies in the Pacific. So we will have a great role for these, especially two kinds of systems, two kinds of ground systems, artillery and tanks. And maybe artillery will have a so-called golden age in the next years, in the next decades, especially at the Pacific, because of the ideas of anti-access and area denial, because artillery could be a way to enhance A2AD capability, or they could be a way to punch a hole in an A2AD system.
Fascinating, Dr. Teixeira. Thank you very much. It's amazing because, well, we can see that it is important to maintain tank units and heavy artillery units standing, because war can take many forms. We can fight irregular non-state actors, or we can fight highly technological developed states in the theater of operations. But also, one of the things you mentioned, and that is very important, is because tanks and artillery are important within the scope of what we call combined arms operation. And this is something that will keep going on the future. And I think it's great that you mentioned the Pacific scenario, because we see that the importance of artillery is such that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, decided to create a separate branch of its armed forces focused specifically, well, in what they call the rocket force, that is mainly focused on rocket, artillery, and missiles. So yeah, so it's great to see that this debate, although it's still happening, we see that the reality is something completely different. But although, well, the United States is developing the Abrams family, Germany is trying to come up with new designs for it, for the Rheinmetall tank, and we see constant development on artillery systems. These systems and these tanks are still vulnerable. But well, when we go back to First World War, for example, one of the things we see is that once a vulnerability is found, a way to mitigate these vulnerabilities, it's already on its way to be developed, because when those large battleships started to appear on World War One, basically what the militaries during the time thought was, oh, well, this can be a great idea to counter heavy artillery shelling. So when we come back to contemporary scenarios and we see these vulnerabilities of tanks to NLAWs in Ukraine, or to loitering munitions in Nagorno-Karabakh, and other kinds of systems. Oh, well, how do you think modern militaries, armed forces, and states can develop strategies and ways to mitigate these vulnerabilities? It is only within combined arms operations that this can be mitigated, or it can be done in another way.
Especially regarding main battle tanks and the challenge of defending them and keeping them running on the battlefields. There are several ways to provide countermeasures. One, which is clear and which is the first and most important countermeasure to protect your tanks, is the correct employment of them, which is in a scenario of combined arms. So since the mass usage of tanks in the Cambrai offensive in 1970, in the First World War, we have always infantry supporting tanks and tanks supporting infantry. This gives the tanks incredible protection, because infantry could flush anti-tank teams, could provide a support that the tank could not solve alone. So also at the same time, the evolution of anti-tank measures and tank protection measures are a parallel run, a parallel competition, which we have an advance in an anti-tank system. So a tank advanced to enhance his protection about that particular countermeasure. So what we have here, and that debate was heated because of Ukraine, because the Russians lost so many T-72s, T-72s, and T-80s and T-90s, but not many T-90s. It's important to measure many T-72s, because what was the strategic concept of the then Soviet Union to produce the seven? What is the rationale to produce the T-72? He would be a tank employing in large and great formations that will overrun Western Europe. That was the Soviet plan. Everyone knows, NATO knows, the Warsaw Pact knows. So doesn't matter he was a great main battle tank. What matters is American forces, NATO forces will, in a hypothetical scenario, we won't fight one Abrams, we'll fight one T-72. No, one Abrams will fight 10 T-72s, 15 T-72s, 20 T-72s. So, and the Soviets know that in a certain moment, probably when the Soviet armored forces will reaches the Rhine, probably NATO will use tactical nuclear weapons. So doesn't matter that the tank has a great quality. Which matters is speed, the cannon, the 125 cannon that they have, and the fact that he will be employed in mass, in great armored mass. That is what the rationale. So we cannot judge the fact that American javelins, British NLAWs, Swedish Carl-Gustavs, and German Panzerfaust 3s are knocking several Russian tanks, because that kind of Russian tanks, even modernized, are prepared for another kind of war. And especially in the first weeks of the Russian military action in Ukraine, they had been not used in a combined armed scenario. They had been used as almost like a military parade, because the Russians think, as many in the West think, and people are now trying to forget or erase this, but the fact is many people does not expect that the Ukrainians have a whole and such a fanatical resistance. But this is, I think that unfortunately many people in the Western defense apparatus have ignorance of historical matters, because if they had stopped to study 15 minutes of Ukrainian history, they will know that at the moment that the first Russian soldier set foot in Ukrainian soil, the Ukrainians will fanatically resist, because to the Ukrainians, the Russians are not a brotherly people. They are conquerors, they are invaders, and they are occupiers, because they had tasted already the flavors of Russian occupation as part of a Russian empire, and a Soviet occupation as part of the Soviet Union. So the Ukrainians know what is to be under Russian cadre, under Russian domination. And this is a fact that many people in the West have forgotten, unfortunately. And now they're trying to remember and say, no, the Ukrainians are resisting because they know to resist the Russians. So why the fact that the Western had taken out their diplomats and diplomatic staff when the beginning of the invasion in February 24, when many of the European powers didn't come back his diplomats to Kyiv? Because many people doesn't believe that the Ukrainians could resist, despite the facts and the success that the Ukrainians are having applying anti-tank measures. So the fact that anti-tank systems are having a great success is because also the Russians are using outdated materials with the invasion. The T-90s are being knocked out by many of the Western anti-tank weapons that had been given to the Ukrainians. Yes, you have some success, but the T-90s have an active protection system that the T-80 and the T-72 in its all versions doesn't have. So this is a running, and the lessons are being learned by the Russians and by the Western forces. So we could see after this war ends, or maybe even in the midst of this war, that in some moment that the Russians could employ some armored forces with an active protection system that could deal with the Western anti-tank materials, and that will be an evolution. So they will need to provide new actualizations, new upgrades of these anti-tank weapons. The Carl-Gustav that had been used by Ukrainian forces are the Carl-Gustav 4, the evolution of the Carl-Gustav that had been developed in the late 1960s and being employed since when. But we need to pay attention to the fact that the NLAW and the British NLAW and the Javelin could be employed at 2 kilometers. So this gives a relative safety to the anti-tank team. But other anti-tank materials are not that not have such range. So when you employ an anti-tank weapon, you are putting yourself in harm's way. You are putting yourself into danger, because you are really in your position, and the Russians could counter your position if we use the Ukrainian scenario. So that is a branding and an evolution. And certainly their lessons will be learned by the Russians, who are already learned the lessons and beginning to employ combined arms maneuvers. And this is the why we are not seeing more of many of these videos that have circulated in social media in the late February and March of several Russian tanks being knocked out. And they are doing the right measures of force protection, using tanks with infantry, using tanks protected by helicopters, helicopters protected by anti-aircraft systems that could intercept our missiles launched by Ukrainians against the, and you see many Russian helicopters are now not flying so high in the sky, but flying very, very low, very close to the terrain, very close to soil, because this will give an advantage of surprise, and will in some way provide protection for the helicopters. So the fact that many tanks are being knocked out now, it's because we have many weapons that have been designed to knock out them. But this is just an evolution, just a step in this evolution, in which in some moments the tank has some advantage against the anti-tank systems, and in some moment anti-tank systems have some advantage against the tanks.